Hey everyone, it's Wednesday, time for a little Wisdom Wednesday. Today I thought I would spend just a little bit of time going through current recommendations for health screenings. I've had a lot of folks coming in, how often do I have to have a pap smear? How often do I need to have a mammogram, etc. So I thought I would kind of walk through, because things have kind of changed recently in that they've been able to utilize data because of electronic medical records, and also just from the review of studies and realizing that a lot of the things that we've been doing on an annual basis are not necessary in terms of either early detection or prevention or keeping us alive longer, etc. So I think we'll just kind of dive in and get started. And I thought I would start with the aspect of pap smears for women. And this is something that I think for certainly my generation, we just felt like that we had to come in every year, get a pap test, because it was just so good at detecting changes in the cervix way before we would ever see any type of malignancy or real issue with cervical cancer. And it certainly did have a major impact on women's health, being able to screen for this particular cancer. And then of course, after I even began practice, we then were able to identify an inciting viral infection, the HPV virus, and subsequent to that, now we have even a vaccine for that. So we can screen for the viral particles and also just for abnormal cells. And fortunately for our general population, patients are very compliant and have come in, and we're so used to having to come in yearly for a pap smear, but it appears that we don't need to do it quite so often. And so at this stage of life, what we're seeing is now for aged less than 21 years old, it is no screening whatsoever. And we even started doing pap smears on women once they became sexually active. So we don't do that at all. From age 21 to 29, it is cytology alone, only every 3 years. So don't need to even do HPV testing. It seems that women who do contract HPV at this stage are able to clear it with it very rapidly and easily within a year or two. So we don't even test for HPV at that point. Then from age 30 to 65, cytology alone, you can pick one of these three things. You can do cytology alone every 3 years. You can do an FDA-approved primary HPV testing alone for every 5 years, or co-testing HPV and cytology every 5 years. So that is the current recommendations. I think we still are so used to having people come in for pap tests every year that we still often are sort of stuck in that loop. But the reality is that if you've not had any abnormal pap smears and no high-risk type activity, meaning multiple sexual partners or exposures that you know of, then you are safe to choose one of these. And for women over age 65, no screening after adequate negative screening tests, meaning 3 negative paps, you no longer need to do any screening. And certainly after hysterectomy, there's no real screening there unless there's a history of a high-grade lesion. So we still do an awful lot of screening and spending insurance dollars on these tests, and it seems that perhaps we're over-testing and don't need to really do those tests. I know it's a very reassuring type of a process for people, but we just really don't need to do that. Now, this is the recommendation for the United States task force that is set up for this particular purpose, to screen for the abnormal cells in the cervix. This is not necessarily ACOG's recommendations, but that is currently what the recommendation by the task force is. Now, for breast cancer screening, mammography is, of course, the standard of care in our country today. There are other forms of screening, such as thermography, but not necessarily approved for that, but that certainly is another option. But the United States Preventive Services Task Force has recommended that women start doing mammograms age 50 to 74 who are at an average risk for breast cancer, and they should get a mammogram every 2 years. That's a little different than what we've done in the past as well. That women who are 40 to 49 should talk about when they should start this. I know that, again, for my generation, we started doing mammograms at 35 and we're doing them yearly. So this is what the United States Preventive Services Task Force has recommended. And again, if you want to decide to do it prior to the age of 50, it certainly is something that can be considered. But generally speaking, not done unless we feel something and need to pursue any form of diagnostic testing at that point. Certainly MRIs can be added as well, but in general, at women with average risk, it is every 2 years from age 50 to 74. Again, kind of a new way of looking at it in terms of early diagnosis. This is not a preventive test whatsoever. It is just strictly an early diagnosis. So that's what's recommended. And then for colonoscopy, the last thing I wanted to kind of touch base on is that for, again, my generation was starting at age 50, but now they have moved that up to age 45, and it's recommended that it should be for average risk every 10 years from age 45 to age 75. And if there's any other high risk aspects to either a family history of an adult member of your family being diagnosed prior to the age of 60, then you want to do it 10 years prior to that. So again, if you have polyps or if there are findings that are concerning on a colonoscopy, then your doctor will advise you whether you need to repeat either yearly, every 3 years, every 5 years. But for average risk, it is every 10 years starting at age 45 through 75. And then they are not recommending any screening after the age of 85. So these are kind of interesting new ways of looking at it. And of course, we've talked about the new liquid biopsy test that's out there, the Galleri test, that screens for 50 cancers. This should not replace any of these screening tests that we've talked about at this point. I don't think that anyone would say you shouldn't pursue a mammogram or a pap smear or colonoscopy. However, there are some other tests out there, and at some point we may find that these tests will be obsolete and we'll be doing other tests into the future. We know that Cologuard is also a DNA test that is a stool test that you send off and is a screening for colon cancer. And if there are some abnormal cells or abnormal DNA seen with Cologuard, then you would pursue a colonoscopy. We know that 13% of people without cancer may have a positive result with a Cologuard, and that 8% of people with cancer may have a negative Cologuard. So it's not perfect. No test really is. Just wanted to kind of review these because people are asking, how often do I have to do this, and do I need to do this every year, etc. And there are some interestingly changes that are happening and new guidelines that we're seeing. And we are in a flux as well and transitional period, because I think that we'll be seeing new, more innovative ways and perhaps less invasive ways of doing testing as we move into the future. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of insight. We haven't really changed a lot in our practice. Women just feel more comfortable doing annual pap smears and perhaps even doing annual mammograms. And so whether or not payers are going to continue to pay for them as we have done them in the past, they may begin to start filtering out and not doing as much reimbursement for a lot of these tests as some of these new guidelines come into practice more frequently. So just wanted to let you know. Hope you all have a great week, and we'll talk again next week.